Sometimes the most catastrophic events in human history start with someone saying, "Hold my beer." Comment below what time you're listening to this, because misery loves company, and smash that like button. Subscribe for more tales of humans. Throughout history, millions have died, and entire cultures have vanished, not because of natural disasters, plagues, or cosmic events, but because someone, somewhere, made a decision so monumentally stupid that it echoes through the centuries. We're about to journey through the most spectacular human failures ever recorded, starting with a story that proves alcohol has been ruining perfectly good military campaigns since before your great-great-great-grandmother was even a twinkle in anyone's eye. Buckle up, because what you're about to hear will make you question how our species ever made it this far. On the battle that never was, September 1788, somewhere in what's now Romania, the mighty Austrian Empire has assembled 100,000 soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, hardened warriors ready to face the fearsome Ottoman Empire. These aren't weekend militia members playing dress-up. These are professional killers with fancy uniforms and expensive moustaches. The Austrian army sets up camp near the town of Karansibis, which sounds like the kind of place where nothing interesting ever happens. How wrong they were about that. The plan was simple, really. Send a scouting party across the river, find the Turkish army, report back, then proceed with the noble art of organised violence. What could possibly go wrong? Well, as it turns out, absolutely everything. The scouts crossed the river, weapons ready, adrenaline pumping, prepared for glory and honour, and all those other things that look great on recruiting posters. Instead of finding turbaned enemies brandishing curved swords, they stumble upon some Romani people who offer them something far more dangerous than any Ottoman blade: alcohol. Now, anyone who's ever been to a university knows that when soldiers meet booze, rational decision-making takes a holiday to somewhere far, far away. These Austrian scouts, probably thinking they deserved a little liquid courage before facing certain death, gladly accepted this generous offer. Meanwhile, back at camp, another group of Austrian soldiers decides they too should cross the river. Perhaps they were feeling left out, or maybe they just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. When they arrive at the impromptu tavern situation, they politely ask if they might partake in the festivities. The first group, now several drinks into their military careers as professional idiots, look at their fellow Austrians and make a decision that would echo through military history as the single dumbest thing anyone has ever done while wearing a uniform. They refuse to share the alcohol. Let me repeat that. Austrian soldiers set up a defensive position against other Austrian soldiers to protect their beer from other beer-loving Austrian soldiers. This is the moment where any reasonable person would step back and say, "Hang on, lads, we're all on the same side here." Instead, someone, and history will never record who, because even drunk people have some sense of shame, fired a shot. What happened next can only be described as the military equivalent of a Three Stooges routine, except with real muskets and actual casualties. The two groups of Austrians began fighting each other with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for actual enemies. Shots were fired, swords were drawn, and somewhere in heaven, every military strategist who ever lived began weeping uncontrollably. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. In the confusion of Austrians shooting Austrians over the God-given right to get plastered before battle, someone shouted, "Turks, Turks," in Romanian. Now, this might have been an attempt to restore some semblance of military order, or it might have been the booze talking. Either way, it had the same effect as shouting "fire" in a crowded theatre, except the theatre was a military camp and everyone had weapons. Panic spread through the troops like gossip at a church social. These soldiers, remember, came from all over the Austrian Empire. Germans, Hungarians, Croatians, Czechs, a delightful multicultural army where half the troops couldn't understand what the other half were saying on a good day, let alone during a crisis involving alcohol and gunfire. Officers trying to restore order began shouting "Halt! Halt!" in German, which is what responsible military leaders do when their troops start behaving like drunken football hooligans. Unfortunately, to soldiers who didn't speak German, particularly those already convinced they were under attack by Ottoman forces, "Halt, halt" sounded remarkably like "Allah." This misunderstanding transformed a stupid drinking dispute into what the troops believed was a full-scale Turkish assault. Soldiers who moments before had been arguing about alcohol suddenly found themselves running for their lives from an enemy that existed only in their alcohol-addled imaginations. Picture 100,000 seasoned warriors fleeing in absolute terror from absolutely nothing. Grown men with years of military training, dropping their weapons and running like children who'd just seen a spider, except the spider was their own shadow, and their own shadow was apparently Turkish. As the panicked soldiers stampeded back toward their main camp, General Colloredo, and yes, that was actually his name, which sounds like a pasta dish, but was apparently a person, saw what appeared to be a retreat under enemy fire. Being a dutiful military commander who'd probably seen actual battles and knew what real attacks looked like, he did what any reasonable general would do. He ordered his artillery to fire on his own troops. The Austrian army had achieved something remarkable. They had managed to defeat themselves so thoroughly that their own general was shelling them. This wasn't friendly fire, this was friendly artillery bombardment, which is considerably less friendly than the name suggests. When the smoke cleared and the screaming stopped, the Austrian Empire had suffered between 150 and 1,000 casualties, depending on which report you believe. The higher number seems more likely, given that entire military units had apparently forgotten how to recognize their own uniforms, while simultaneously demonstrating a complete inability to distinguish between German and Turkish. 2 days later, the actual Ottoman army arrived to find the smoking remains of what had once been a formidable Austrian force. The Turks, probably thinking this was some elaborate Austrian military strategy they didn't understand, cautiously approached the carnage. What they discovered was better than Christmas morning, a major Austrian position virtually undefended with dead and wounded soldiers scattered about and absolutely no resistance whatsoever. They took the town of Karansebes without firing a single shot, probably while wondering if this was some sort of trap or if the Austrians had really managed to defeat themselves so completely that conquest had become unnecessary. The Battle of Karansebes entered military history not as a tactical engagement between opposing forces, but as definitive proof that alcohol and warfare should never, under any circumstances, be mixed. It became known as the worst friendly fire incident in military history, which is quite an achievement considering how many ways soldiers have found to accidentally kill each other over the centuries. This disaster perfectly illustrates humanity's remarkable talent for transforming simple situations into spectacular catastrophes through a combination of poor judgment, miscommunication, and what can only be described as weapons-grade stupidity. But this was just the beginning of our journey through human incompetence. The Austrian army's drunken self-destruction pales in comparison to what happens when an entire civilization decides to listen to a teenager's advice about livestock management. 2. The Prophet of Doom. When faith meets famine. While Austrian soldiers were busy discovering innovative ways to shoot themselves over beer distribution rights, halfway around the world in southern Africa, an entire civilization was about to make those drunken military disasters look like minor tactical hiccups. The year was 1856, and the Exosa people were having what you might diplomatically call a rough decade. Their cattle were dying from something called lung sickness, which sounds about as pleasant as it actually was, and British colonizers were steadily grabbing their land with the enthusiasm of people who'd convinced themselves they were doing everyone a favor. Imagine you're watching your livestock die, your traditional way of life crumble, and foreign invaders methodically steal everything you've ever known. You'd probably be pretty desperate for some good news from somewhere, anywhere. Enter Noncolwurs, a teenage Isosa girl who claimed she'd received what was essentially a divine text message with very specific instructions for solving all their problems. Now, when most teenagers claim they've got messages from beyond, responsible adults usually suggest they get some fresh air and maybe cut back on whatever they've been smoking behind the barn. But Noncos had something most teenage prophets lack: family connections, and spectacularly bad timing. The spirits of her ancestors had allegedly appeared to her with a plan so simple it was brilliant, and so brilliant it was absolutely insane. Kill all your cattle, they told her. Destroy all your crops. Throw away all your weapons. Do this and the dead will rise again. Healthy cattle will magically appear from thin air. Crops will spontaneously regenerate, and here's the real kicker. All those pesky European colonizers will be swept into the sea like particularly unwelcome beach debris. It's the kind of plan that makes sense only if you've either hit your head very hard or you're operating under the assumption that the laws of physics are more like gentle suggestions that can be overruled by sufficient religious enthusiasm. But Nonkawis had an uncle named Mailakaza, who was both a traditional spiritual leader and a former Christian convert. This gave him the unique qualification of having been disappointed by two different religious systems, which apparently made him the perfect person to endorse a third option that combined the worst aspects of both. When his teenage niece came to him, claiming she'd received cosmic instructions to destroy everything necessary for survival, Masklakaza didn't react the way most sensible adults would, by suggesting she lie down until the visions went away. Instead, he looked at this plan to systematically eliminate all food sources and thought, yes, this sounds like exactly the kind of forward-thinking agricultural policy our people need. Masklakaza shared Nonku's prophecy with Chief Sari Lee, who apparently decided that taking livestock management advice from a teenager channeling dead people was precisely the sort of innovative leadership approach the situation demanded. Because nothing says sound governance like betting your entire civilization on the agricultural insights of someone who probably shouldn't be trusted to choose her own breakfast. Chief Sarili ordered his people to begin what can only be described as the most thorough act of agricultural suicide in human history, and they did it. With the kind of systematic efficiency that would have impressed industrial planners, the Xhosa people began methodically destroying everything they needed to stay alive. Over the next year, approximately 400,000 cattle were killed. To put this in perspective, that's roughly equivalent to deciding that every cow in Ireland needs to die because a teenager said some ghosts told her it would solve unemployment. The Xhosa also stopped planting crops, which meant they were simultaneously destroying their present food supply while guaranteeing they wouldn't have a future one either. The logic, if we can dignify it with that term, was that demonstrating faith by eliminating current resources would speed up the promised miraculous transformation. It's the kind of reasoning that makes burning down your house to make room for a mansion seem prudent, assuming the mansion is guaranteed to appear and isn't just a product of someone's overactive imagination. As the months passed and the promised miracle failed to materialize with typical spiritual punctuality, you might expect that reasonable people would begin questioning this strategy. You might think someone would point out that dead cattle have a disturbing tendency to stay dead, and that destroyed crops don't typically resurrect themselves overnight. You would be catastrophically wrong. Instead of admitting that perhaps taking agricultural advice from teenage mystics wasn't humanity's most brilliant survival strategy, the true believers doubled down with the kind of determination usually reserved for people trying to fix broken electronics by hitting them harder. The spirits were obviously testing their faith, they reasoned. The miracle was just running a bit behind schedule, like a cosmic bus that would definitely arrive if they just waited long enough and destroyed enough food in the meantime. Meanwhile, the cattle continued dying, not from miraculous transformation into healthy livestock, but from the same lung sickness that had been killing them all along. The difference was that now, instead of having some healthy cattle to partially offset their losses, they had no cattle at all because they deliberately slaughtered the healthy ones to demonstrate their religious commitment. By early 1858, reality arrived with all the subtlety of a brick through a cathedral window. The dead had not risen, unless you counted the increasing number of people who were dying from the perfectly predictable consequences of eliminating their food supply. Healthy cattle had not materialized from the spiritual dimension. Crops had not spontaneously regenerated through sheer force of wishful thinking. The European colonizers remained stubbornly unswept into the sea, probably because ocean currents don't actually respond to religious fervour, no matter how sincere. What had appeared instead was famine, not the gentle, gradual kind that gives people time to adapt and find alternatives, but the sudden, devastating kind that happens when you deliberately destroy your entire food production system based on the cosmic insights of someone who probably needed adult supervision. Approximately 40,000 Exosa people died of starvation. 40,000 human beings starved to death because an entire civilization decided that a teenager's conversations with dead people constituted sound agricultural policy. Let that number marinate in your brain for a moment while you contemplate humanity's remarkable capacity for turning hope into horror. The survivors, desperate and dying, had no choice but to seek help from the very British colonizers they'd been told would be swept away by spiritual forces. They migrated to the British-controlled Cape Colony, where they worked for food under conditions that were, to put it with magnificent understatement, somewhat less than ideal. The British colonial government, led by Governor George Grey, looked at this humanitarian catastrophe and saw not a tragedy requiring compassion, but a business opportunity requiring exploitation. They seized Exosa lands with the kind of administrative efficiency that suggested they'd been planning this expansion all along, forced survivors into hard labour, and allowed British settlers to farm the newly available territory. What had begun as a spiritual prophecy promising liberation became the mechanism of complete subjugation. The Xhosa cattle killing effectively ended organised Xhosa resistance to British colonisation, not through military defeat or political negotiation, but through what can only be described as divinely inspired self-destruction. This wasn't the first time in history that desperate people had made terrible decisions based on supernatural promises, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. But the Xhosa cattle killing stands out for its sheer scale, its complete failure, and its demonstration of how quickly reasonable people can convince themselves that unreasonable solutions make perfect sense when they're facing impossible circumstances. The tragedy illustrates a fundamental truth about human psychology. When people are confronted with problems that seem unsolvable through normal means, they become willing to believe in abnormal solutions, even when those solutions require actions that guarantee disaster. The more desperate the situation, the more appealing magical thinking becomes, particularly when that thinking is endorsed by respected community leaders who should know better. But if you think teenage prophets giving catastrophic advice to entire civilizations represents the absolute peak of human decision-making disasters, buckle up, because we're about to meet someone who managed to make mystical agricultural policies look like minor administrative errors. Sometimes the most devastating mistakes in history aren't made by spiritual visionaries or drunken soldiers, but by perfectly reasonable bureaucrats, armed with maps, good intentions, and absolutely no understanding of what they're about to unleash. Our next story takes us to 1947, when a British lawyer who'd never been to India was handed a pencil and asked to casually redraw the borders of one of the world's most complex regions. What could possibly go wrong when you ask someone who's never visited a country to decide where millions of people should live for the rest of their lives? As it turns out, absolutely everything that could go wrong, and several things that nobody had even thought to worry about. 3. When cartography becomes catastrophe. Just as the Exosa people were discovering that spiritual prophecies make terrible agricultural policy, across the Indian Ocean, the British Empire was preparing to demonstrate that bureaucratic incompetence could be just as devastating as mystical delusions. Sometimes the most catastrophic decisions in history are made not by madmen or prophets, but by reasonable people trying to do reasonable things in completely unreasonable ways. The year was 1947, and the British had finally decided to pack up their colonial experiment and leave India to sort itself out. This sounds like a perfectly sensible decision. After all, most people eventually get tired of uninvited house guests, even if those guests have been living in your house for 200 years and claiming they were doing you a favour. The problem was that India had become rather complicated during those 2 centuries of British management. The subcontinent was home to hundreds of millions of people speaking dozens of languages, practicing different religions, and nursing various grievances against each other that had been carefully cultivated during centuries of divide-and-rule colonial administration. The Muslim League wanted a separate nation for Muslims. The Indian National Congress wanted to keep India united. Both sides had compelling arguments, passionate supporters, and absolutely no interest in compromising. Violence was beginning to break out between communities, and it was becoming clear that something needed to be done quickly before the situation deteriorated into full-scale civil war. Enter Lord Mountbatten, the last British Viceroy of India, who looked at this incredibly complex situation and decided that the best solution was to move the independence date forward to August 1947. This gave everyone approximately 5 minutes, in historical terms, to figure out how to divide one of the world's most complex regions into 2 functional countries. But here's where the story transforms from merely concerning to absolutely bonkers. They decided to give the job of drawing the new borders to a man named Sir Cyril Radcliffe, who had never been to India. Let me repeat that because it's important. They asked someone who had never visited the subcontinent to decide where millions of people would live, work and die for the foreseeable future. This is roughly equivalent to asking someone who's never seen a pizza to redesign your kitchen, except with considerably higher stakes. Radcliffe was, by all accounts, a perfectly competent British lawyer. He understood maps, he could read population data, and he probably made excellent decisions about things like contract disputes and property law. What he didn't understand was India, because he'd never been there, never met the people whose lives he was about to reshape, and had no real appreciation for the mind-boggling complexity of the task he'd been handed. The brief was simple in the way that most impossible tasks are simple: separate areas with Muslim majorities, which would become Pakistan, from areas with Hindu and Sikh majorities, which would remain India. Easy, right? Just look at the religious demographics, draw some lines, job done. Except that people, inconveniently, don't organise themselves according to neat demographic patterns that translate easily to maps. Villages with different religious majorities sat next to each other. Hindu temples and Muslim mosques existed side by side. Sikh communities were scattered throughout regions that would have to be assigned to either India or Pakistan. Economic centres served religiously diverse populations. Radcliffe was given a few weeks to sort all this out using maps and population statistics. A few weeks to make decisions that would determine the fate of roughly 400 million people. Most people take longer to choose a new car. Working frantically with inadequate information and impossible deadlines, Radcliffe drew his line. The Radcliffe Line, as it became known, would separate the new nations of India and Pakistan. The final border wasn't announced until August 17th, 1947, 2 days after both countries had already become independent. This means that millions of people woke up on August 15th, 1947, having no idea which country they were citizens of. Imagine going to sleep in one nation and waking up in another without having moved house, except you don't know which nation either one is because the borders haven't been announced yet. The new boundary line cut through the middle of villages, separated farms from their fields, divided families from their homes, and split communities that had lived together for generations. It was as if someone had taken a map of Europe and randomly decided that half of London was now in France, without bothering to ask anyone who lived there what they thought about this arrangement. The results were immediate and devastating. When people finally learned where the borders had been drawn, those who found themselves on the wrong side faced an impossible choice: abandon everything they'd ever known and flee to a country they'd never seen, or stay and hope for the best as a religious minority in a nation created specifically for the other religion. Between 12 and 20 million people chose to move. This wasn't voluntary migration in search of better opportunities. This was desperate flight from potential violence, carrying whatever possessions could be gathered quickly, leaving behind homes, businesses and communities built over lifetimes. The journey was a nightmare. Trains packed with refugees became targets for violence. Convoys of migrants were attacked by mobs from communities they'd lived peacefully beside for years. Women were kidnapped, families were separated, and neighbours who had shared meals became mortal enemies overnight. The death toll from this partition-induced migration ranges from several 100,000 to 2 million people, depending on whose estimates you believe. The higher numbers seem more likely, given the scale of the displacement and the intensity of the violence that accompanied it. This wasn't genocide in the technical sense. There was no organised government policy of extermination. This was something arguably worse: spontaneous, community-level violence fueled by fear, uncertainty, and the sudden transformation of neighbours into enemies based on arbitrary lines drawn by someone who'd never met any of them. The partition of India stands as one of history's clearest examples of how good intentions, bureaucratic efficiency, and complete ignorance of local conditions can combine to create humanitarian disasters of staggering proportions. Radcliffe genuinely tried to do his job well. British administrators genuinely believed they were preventing civil war, and political leaders genuinely thought partition was the least bad option available. They were probably right that partition was better than full-scale civil war. What they didn't anticipate was that poorly planned partition could be almost as destructive as the conflict they were trying to prevent, while creating new sources of tension that would poison relations between India and Pakistan for generations. The Radcliffe Line became one of the most dangerous borders in the world, separating two nations that have fought multiple wars and currently possess nuclear weapons largely pointed at each other. The refugee crisis of 1947 created communities of displaced people whose descendants still tell stories of the homes their grandparents lost, when a British lawyer they'd never met decided their village was in the wrong country. But if you think that asking someone who'd never visited India to redraw its borders represents peak bureaucratic overreach, you haven't met Trofim Lysenko. While Radcliffe's mistake affected millions of people for a few catastrophic years, Lysenko's scientific theories managed to starve entire nations for decades. Our next story takes us to the Soviet Union, where a man who fundamentally misunderstood how plants work convinced Joseph Stalin that genetics was a capitalist conspiracy. What happened next proves that sometimes the most dangerous person in any society isn't the one with the biggest army, but the one with the most confident ignorance about basic biology. 4. The scientist who hated science. When politics meets plants, and everyone dies. While Sir Cyril Radcliffe was learning that drawing borders from a distance can be catastrophically problematic in the Soviet Union, a man named Trofim Lysenko was about to prove that rejecting basic science in favour of wishful thinking could be even more deadly than the worst cartographic disasters. Lysenko wasn't just wrong about biology. He was spectacularly, creatively, almost artistically wrong in ways that take genuine talent to achieve. He looked at centuries of scientific research, carefully considered the evidence, and then decided that all of it was capitalist propaganda designed to undermine the glorious Soviet agricultural system. To understand just how magnificently wrong Lysenko was, you need to understand what real scientists had figured out about heredity. Gregor Mendel, working with pea plants in the 1860s, had discovered that traits are passed from parents to offspring through discrete units we now call genes. This was revolutionary science that explained why children resemble their parents, why some traits skip generations, and how selective breeding actually works. Lysenko looked at this well-established science and decided it was all nonsense, not because he had better evidence, mind you, but because genetic inheritance didn't fit with communist ideology. You see, genetics suggested that some traits were fixed and inherited, which sounded suspiciously like the kind of class-based determinism that communism was supposed to eliminate. Instead, Lysenko promoted what he called vernalization, the idea that you could change a plant's characteristics by exposing it to different environmental conditions, and that these learned changes would then be passed on to the next generation. For example, he claimed that if you exposed wheat seeds to cold temperatures, their offspring would be more resistant to cold weather, even if they were never exposed to cold themselves. This is roughly equivalent to believing that if you teach your dog to play piano, your dog's puppies will be born knowing Mozart. It's the kind of logic that makes astrology look like rigorous science. But Lysenko had something that legitimate scientists often lack: political skill. He understood that in Stalin's Soviet Union, the most important qualification for any position wasn't competence or knowledge, but the ability to tell Stalin what he wanted to hear with sufficient enthusiasm and conviction. Stalin desperately wanted Soviet agriculture to succeed through sheer communist willpower, and Lysenko promised that his theories could dramatically increase crop yields using methods that aligned perfectly with Soviet ideology. Plants, according to Lysenko, were naturally communist. They didn't compete with each other but cooperated for the collective good. Genetic inheritance was a capitalist myth. Environmental conditioning was the true mechanism of biological improvement. This was exactly what Stalin wanted to hear: science that proved communist ideology was not only politically superior but biologically correct. In 1940, Lysenko was appointed director of the Institute of Genetics of the Academy of Sciences of the Soviet Union, giving him control over all biological research in the country. Lysenko used his power with the kind of enthusiasm that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. Scientists who disagreed with his theories were fired, imprisoned, or worse. Real geneticists found their careers destroyed and their research banned. Some, like the brilliant plant scientist Nikolai Vavilov, died in prison for the crime of understanding how heredity actually works. The result was that Soviet biology became dominated not by evidence-based research but by politically acceptable fantasies that had no connection to reality. It was as if the Soviet Union had decided that gravity was a capitalist conspiracy and ordered all their physicists to develop theories based on things falling upward. Meanwhile, Lysenko's agricultural methods were implemented across the Soviet Union with the kind of thorough efficiency that Soviet bureaucracy reserved for its most catastrophic mistakes. Farmers were ordered to plant seeds extremely close together because Lysenko believed that plants of the same species would cooperate rather than compete for resources. Real biologists could have told them this was insane. Plants absolutely do compete for sunlight, water, and nutrients, and planting them too close together results in stunted growth and reduced yields. But real biologists had been silenced, imprisoned, or shot, so there was nobody left to point out that Lysenko's methods were guaranteed to fail. The results were predictably disastrous. Crop yields plummeted across the Soviet Union, or famines became more frequent and severe. Millions of people starved to death because the Soviet government had decided that scientific evidence was less important than ideological purity. But Lysenko wasn't finished destroying agriculture yet. His influence spread to China, where Mao Zedong enthusiastically embraced Lysenko's theories as part of the Great Leap Forward. Chinese farmers were ordered to implement Lysenko's methods, planting seeds extremely close together, believing that revolutionary fervor could overcome biological limitations. The result was the Great Chinese Famine, which killed between 15 and 45 million people, one of the worst famines in human history. This wasn't a natural disaster caused by drought or disease. It was a man-made catastrophe caused by the systematic rejection of basic biological science in favor of politically convenient nonsense. Think about that for a moment. Lysenko's theories were so wrong, so fundamentally misguided, that they managed to cause mass starvation in 2 different countries across multiple decades. His ideas were like agricultural poison that killed everything they touched. The truly maddening part is that the real science was readily available. Geneticists around the world understood heredity and had developed effective agricultural techniques based on actual evidence. But the Soviet Union and China decided that foreign science was suspiciously capitalist and that their own ideologically pure scientists knew better. It's worth noting that during this same period, countries using evidence-based agricultural science were experiencing unprecedented increases in crop yields. The Green Revolution was dramatically improving food security worldwide through the development of high-yield crop varieties based on, you guessed it, genetic science that Lysenko had banned. While the Soviet Union was starving its people with pseudo-scientific agriculture, places like Mexico and India were feeding growing populations with techniques developed by scientists who understood how plants actually work. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. Real science was saving lives while Lysenko's ideology was ending them. After Stalin died in 1953, Lysenko gradually began losing power, though he managed to hang on much longer than anyone with his track record had any right to expect. By the 1960s, Soviet scientists like Andrei Sakharov were openly criticizing him as a fraud who had set Soviet biology back by decades and caused millions of unnecessary deaths. Lysenko was finally removed from his positions in 1965, but the damage had been done. The Soviet Union never fully recovered from the decades of agricultural disasters his theories had caused, and China's recovery from the Great Chinese Famine took years and required a complete rejection of Lysenko's methods. The story of Trofim Lysenko demonstrates how dangerous it can be when politics overrides science, especially in areas that directly affect human survival. His career is a masterclass in how confident ignorance can be more dangerous than honest uncertainty, and how the people who suffer most from bad science are rarely the ones making the decisions. But if you think that scientists giving deadly advice to dictators represents the pinnacle of historical irresponsibility, our next story will introduce you to a completely different kind of mistake: the unintended consequences of creating the perfect military machine. Sometimes the biggest disasters in history aren't caused by incompetence or ignorance, but by plans that work exactly as intended until they don't. Our next tale takes us to medieval Egypt, where slave soldiers became the masters of an empire, proving that the most successful military innovations often contain the seeds of their own destruction. 5. The slaves who became kings. While Lysenko was busy starving people with bad science, our historical tour of spectacular human miscalculation takes us back several centuries to witness a masterclass in unintended consequences. You're running a medieval Islamic empire, and you have a military problem. Your army consists of various tribal groups, local militias, and regional lords who all have their own loyalties, agendas, and unfortunate tendencies to switch sides whenever it becomes politically convenient. What you need is a military force that's absolutely loyal, professionally trained, and has no conflicting allegiances. So you develop what seems like a brilliant solution. Create an elite military class from slaves who have no existing ties to local politics, no tribal loyalties to complicate their decision-making, and no choice but to serve you faithfully, since you literally own them. This was the thinking behind the Mamluk system, which began in the 9th century, and seemed like such a clever idea that various Islamic rulers enthusiastically adopted it for centuries. The word Mamluk literally means owned. These were slave soldiers, but not the kind of slaves you might imagine from other historical contexts. Mamluks were typically young boys from non-Arab backgrounds, Turks, Caucasians, Central Asians, who were purchased or captured and then subjected to an intensive training program that would make modern special forces recruitment look like summer camp. These weren't agricultural labourers or domestic servants. They were being groomed to become the ultimate military professionals. The training was comprehensive and brutal. Young Mamluks learned horsemanship, archery, swordplay, military tactics, and Islamic law. They were converted to Islam, taught Arabic, and indoctrinated with absolute loyalty to their masters. The entire process took years and produced warriors who were not only physically formidable but also educated, disciplined, and theoretically completely devoted to their owners. From a military standpoint, the system worked brilliantly. Mamluk armies were among the most effective fighting forces in the medieval world. They had no divided loyalties, no local political connections to complicate their military decisions, and their entire identity was built around professional warfare. When you needed someone conquered, the Mamluks were your go-to solution. But here's where the law of unintended consequences began to assert itself with characteristic ruthlessness. If you create a class of people who are professionally trained to be better at violence than everyone else, eventually they're going to notice that they're better at violence than everyone else, including you. The Mamluks didn't just become excellent soldiers, they became politically sophisticated, militarily dominant, and increasingly aware that they were the real power behind the throne. They had all the weapons, all the training, and all the organizational skills necessary to run a government. The only thing they lacked was official authority, and that turned out to be a problem that violence could solve quite easily. In 1250, the Mamluks looked around at their situation in Egypt and made a collective decision that would have warmed the hearts of management consultants everywhere. They eliminated the middleman. Instead of serving sultans, they decided to become sultans themselves. The Mamluk coup was swift and efficient, which shouldn't have surprised anyone since they'd been trained by the previous government to be swift and efficient at exactly this sort of thing. They established the Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria for the next 267 years. This wasn't just a change of management, it was a complete transformation of the political system. The slaves had become the masters, and they proved to be remarkably effective at the job. The Mamluk Sultanate became one of the most powerful states in the medieval Middle East, successfully defending against both Crusader invasions from Europe and Mongol invasions from Central Asia. They defeated the remnants of the Crusader states, pushing European forces completely out of the Levant. They stopped the Mongol advance westward, preventing the same devastation that had befallen Baghdad and other Islamic centers of learning. By any military measure, the Mamluks were spectacularly successful, but their success created a fascinating paradox. The Mamluk Sultanate continued to rely on the same system that had created them, importing and training new slave soldiers to maintain their military edge. Each generation of Mamluks trained the next generation of potential usurpers, creating a system that was inherently unstable even as it was militarily dominant. The Mamluk political system became a continuous cycle of military training, political intrigue, and power struggles between different Mamluk factions. It was remarkably effective at external defense, but chronically chaotic in terms of internal governance. Sultans were regularly overthrown by their own Mamluk officers, who had been trained by previous sultans to be excellent at overthrowing rulers. Even after the Ottoman Empire conquered Egypt in 1517, the Ottomans were smart enough to recognize that the Mamluks were too useful and too dangerous to simply eliminate. Instead, they kept the Mamluk system in place, using Mamluks as local administrators and military commanders under Ottoman oversight. This arrangement lasted until 1811, when Muhammad Ali Pasha decided that the Mamluks had outlived their usefulness and arranged for their systematic massacre. But by then, the Mamluk system had lasted for over 500 years, demonstrating both its effectiveness and its inherent instability. The Mamluk story illustrates a fundamental problem with many seemingly brilliant solutions. They work exactly as intended until they work too well. Creating a military class with no external loyalties seemed like perfect policy until that military class realized they didn't need external masters either. It's a pattern that appears throughout history, powerful institutions creating the conditions for their own destruction by succeeding too completely at their original mission. The Mamluks were trained to be the ultimate soldiers, and they fulfilled that training so well that they became unstoppable, including by the people who created them. But if you think that training slaves to be military experts represents the height of strategic short-sightedness, wait until you hear about the Byzantine Empire's approach to military recruitment. Sometimes the most catastrophic defeats in history happen not because your soldiers aren't good enough, but because you can never be quite sure which side they're actually fighting for. Our next disaster takes us to the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where the Byzantine Empire learned the hard way that hiring mercenaries from your enemies might not be the most reliable military strategy ever devised. 6. The mercenaries who forgot whose side they were on. When your army includes your enemies, just as the Islamic world was learning that training slave soldiers too well could backfire spectacularly, the Byzantine Empire was about to demonstrate that hiring mercenaries from your enemies might not represent the pinnacle of military strategy. Sometimes the most devastating defeats come not from being outfought by superior forces, but from discovering that half your army was never really your army to begin with. The year was 1071, And Emperor Romanos IV had a problem that would be familiar to any modern manager dealing with budget constraints. He needed to expand his military capabilities without significantly increasing his permanent payroll. The solution seemed obvious: hire freelancers. The Byzantine Empire had been steadily losing territory in eastern Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks, and Romanos decided it was time to take decisive action. He assembled what he believed was a formidable army, combining professional Byzantine troops with a diverse collection of mercenaries from across the known world. This is where the story begins to take on the quality of a disaster movie, where all the warning signs are ignored by characters who really should know better. Romanos's army included not just Byzantine soldiers, but also Norman mercenaries, Armenian fighters, Slavic warriors, and here's where it gets interesting: Turkish mercenaries, who were ethnically and culturally identical to the enemy they were supposedly going to fight. The logic behind hiring Turkish fighters to fight other Turkish fighters was presumably that professional soldiers would remain loyal to whoever was paying them, regardless of ethnic or religious connections. This is the kind of reasoning that sounds sensible in a boardroom but tends to fall apart when people start shooting at their cousins. Romanos split his forces, sending part of his army to capture a nearby fortress while he led the main body toward the town of Manzikert. This decision violated one of the fundamental rules of military strategy: don't divide your forces in enemy territory unless you're absolutely certain you can handle whatever happens next. The detached force never returned. Whether they were defeated, deserted, or simply got lost, the result was that Romanos found himself with a significantly smaller army than he'd planned for, facing an enemy in their home territory, with a collection of troops whose loyalty was, to put it charitably, uncertain. The Seljuk Turks, led by Sultan Alp Arslan, began employing the kind of tactics that made nomadic armies so frustrating to fight against: hit-and-run attacks using mounted archers who would swoop in, shoot a lot of arrows, and disappear before anyone could respond effectively. This type of warfare was particularly demoralizing for heavily armored infantry, who were designed for close combat, but found themselves being peppered with arrows by enemies who refused to stand still long enough to be stabbed properly. It's like trying to fight a swarm of wasps with a baseball bat. Theoretically possible, but practically exhausting and psychologically devastating. Byzantine morale began to crack under the constant harassment. The army was tired, confused, and increasingly convinced that they were being led into a trap by an emperor who seemed to have no clear plan for actually winning the battle. On the day that would become one of the most catastrophic in Byzantine history, Romanos ordered his forces to advance against the Seljuk army. The Byzantines moved forward in formation, probably feeling reasonably confident about their chances in a direct confrontation. But when evening approached and Romanos ordered a tactical withdrawal, a perfectly reasonable military maneuver designed to regroup and prepare for the next day's fighting, everything went catastrophically wrong. Andronikos Doukas, a general from a powerful noble family that had political reasons to dislike Emperor Romanos, chose this moment to demonstrate that personal grudges and military campaigns don't mix well. Instead of following orders, Doukas withdrew his troops from the battlefield entirely. This wasn't a tactical retreat. This was abandonment. In the middle of a delicate military maneuver, with the army partially engaged with enemy forces, a significant portion of the Byzantine force simply left. It was as if a football team's defense decided to go home during the third quarter because they didn't like the coach. The sight of Doukas' troops withdrawing caused panic among the remaining Byzantine soldiers, troops who couldn't see the bigger picture and didn't understand the tactical situation and assumed they were witnessing a rout, and began fleeing in all directions. The carefully organized withdrawal turned into a chaotic retreat, which quickly became a complete collapse of military discipline. Professional soldiers abandoned their positions. Mercenaries decided their contracts didn't cover this level of catastrophe, and what had been an army became a mob of individuals trying to save themselves. The Armenian troops, according to some sources, deserted en masse, though other accounts suggest they fought bravely and suffered heavy casualties. The truth probably varies by unit, but the overall picture was one of an army disintegrating under pressure. The only forces that remained loyal to Romanos were his personal bodyguards and some Armenian infantry units who stayed in position despite the chaos around them. This small, steadfast group found themselves surrounded by the entire Seljuk army as their allies disappeared in every direction. What happened next was unprecedented in Roman military history. Emperor Romanos IV was captured alive by enemy forces. No Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner by a Muslim army. It was a shock that reverberated throughout the Christian and Islamic worlds. The psychological impact of the emperor's capture cannot be overstated. This wasn't just a military defeat, it was a fundamental challenge to Byzantine claims of divine favour and imperial invincibility. If God's chosen emperor could be captured by infidel forces, what did that say about the empire's spiritual legitimacy? Sultan Alp Arslan, demonstrating the kind of political sophistication that had made the Seljuks so successful, treated his imperial prisoner with respect and eventually released him. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. A humiliated but living emperor would be more useful than a dead martyr. Romanos returned to Constantinople, expecting to rally his empire and organize a response to this unprecedented defeat. Instead, he discovered that his enemies at home had used his absence to stage a coup. The Dukas family, whose general had helped cause the disaster at Manzikert, had taken control of the government. The returning emperor was deposed, blinded in the traditional Byzantine fashion for dealing with inconvenient rulers, and sent into exile where he died shortly afterward. The man who had tried to restore Byzantine military fortunes was destroyed not by external enemies, but by internal political rivals who had contributed to his defeat. The Battle of Manzikert marked the beginning of the end for Byzantine control over Anatolia. In the following decades, Turkish tribes flooded into the region, establishing settlements that would eventually become the heartland of the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantines never recovered the territory they lost, and the empire began its long, slow decline toward eventual extinction. The disaster illustrates several timeless truths about military failure. Divided command leads to disaster. Unreliable allies are worse than honest enemies, and political rivalries can be more destructive than foreign invasions. Most importantly, it demonstrates that mercenary armies work only as long as it's profitable and safe to remain loyal, conditions that rarely survive first contact with serious combat. 7. When legal reasoning becomes national catastrophe. While Byzantine emperors were learning that mercenary loyalty expires the moment things get difficult, across the centuries and continents, the United States Supreme Court was preparing to demonstrate that sometimes the most devastating weapons aren't swords or cannons, but legal opinions written by people who think they're being reasonable. The year was 1857, and America was already a powder keg of sectional tensions over slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 had created an uneasy balance between slave and free states, but that balance was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the country expanded westward. What the nation needed was careful, thoughtful leadership that could navigate these dangerous waters without making things worse. Instead, they got the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner, Dr. John Emerson, had taken him from Missouri, a slave state, to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both free territories where slavery was prohibited. After Emerson died, Scott approached the doctor's widow, Irene Emerson, with what seemed like a reasonable request. He wanted to purchase his freedom. Mrs. Emerson, demonstrating the kind of business acumen that would make modern customer service representatives weep with recognition, refused. This decision launched a legal battle that would eventually reach the Supreme Court and tear the country apart. Scott's argument was elegantly simple. He had lived in free territory for years, and according to established legal precedent, this should have made him a free man. It was the kind of straightforward legal reasoning that had been accepted by courts for decades. If you take a slave to a place where slavery is illegal, the slave becomes free. The case worked its way through the court system for over a decade, and by the time it reached the Supreme Court, it had become much more than a simple freedom suit. The justices saw an opportunity to settle the slavery question once and for all through judicial pronouncement. This is where the story transforms from a routine legal case into a masterclass in how good intentions and spectacular arrogance can combine to create national disasters. The Supreme Court didn't just rule against Dred Scott. They used his case as a vehicle to reshape American law in ways that would make the Civil War almost inevitable. Chief Justice Roger Taney, writing for the majority, delivered an opinion that managed to be wrong on multiple levels simultaneously. The court ruled that people of African descent, whether enslaved or free, could never be United States citizens. This wasn't just a ruling about Dred Scott's specific case. It was a sweeping declaration that an entire race of people had no legal rights that white people were bound to respect. But Taney wasn't finished. Having established that black Americans couldn't be citizens, the court then ruled that Scott had no standing to sue in federal court because he wasn't a citizen. This part of the decision was at least logically consistent with their racist premise, even if that premise was morally and legally indefensible. Then came the part that would make the Civil War virtually unavoidable. The court declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. They ruled that Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in federal territories because doing so would violate the Fifth Amendment's protection of property rights. This reasoning transformed enslaved people from human beings into property in the most explicit legal terms possible, and it meant that slavery could legally expand into any territory in the United States. The careful balance between slave and free states that had maintained peace for nearly 4 decades was suddenly null and void. The political implications were staggering. Northern states that had joined the Union with the understanding that slavery's expansion would be limited suddenly found themselves in a country where slavery could potentially spread everywhere. The Missouri Compromise, which had been the foundation of sectional peace, was now worthless paper. Northern reaction was immediate and explosive. Newspapers denounced the decision as judicial tyranny. Politicians who had been moderate on slavery issues found themselves pushed toward more extreme positions. The Republican Party, which had been founded partly to prevent slavery's expansion, suddenly had a rallying cry that resonated with voters who had previously been indifferent to the slavery question. The decision also had devastating effects on the legal system itself. Public faith in the Supreme Court plummeted, particularly in the North, where many people concluded that the court was simply a tool of pro-slavery interests. The idea that judicial decisions should be respected regardless of their content, a cornerstone of American legal tradition, was severely damaged. Abraham Lincoln, then a relatively obscure Republican politician, used the Dred Scott decision to articulate a vision of American democracy that would eventually carry him to the presidency. He argued that a government that declared an entire race of people to be property could not long endure as a democracy, and that the decision represented a fundamental threat to American values. The Dred Scott decision didn't just fail to settle the slavery question, it made settlement impossible through any means other than war. By removing the possibility of political compromise and declaring that slavery could expand anywhere, the court had created a situation where the only remaining options were complete victory for one side or the other. Southern leaders, emboldened by the decision, began making increasingly aggressive demands for federal protection of slavery, not just in territories but potentially in free states as well. Northern leaders, horrified by the implications of the ruling, began preparing for a conflict they now saw as inevitable. The decision also destroyed whatever credibility the federal government had as a neutral arbitrator between sections. Northerners concluded that the entire federal system had been captured by pro-slavery interests, while Southerners became convinced that any retreat from the decision's logic would represent a fundamental attack on their way of life. When Lincoln was elected president in 1860, largely on a platform of opposing slavery's expansion, Southern states began seceding even before he took office. They argued that they couldn't remain in a union where their property rights, as defined by the Supreme Court, weren't respected by the majority of voters. The Civil War that followed cost over 600,000 American lives and devastated large portions of the country. It's impossible to say whether the war would have been avoided without the Dred Scott decision, but it's clear that the ruling made peaceful resolution of sectional differences much more difficult. The decision represents one of the clearest examples in American history of how legal reasoning can go catastrophically wrong when it loses touch with moral reality. The justices thought they were providing legal clarity to a complex political problem, but instead they created a constitutional crisis that could only be resolved through violence. Dred Scott himself, ironically, was freed shortly after the decision through other legal means, but he died within a year of gaining his freedom. He never lived to see the civil war that his case had helped precipitate, or the constitutional amendments that would eventually overturn everything the Supreme Court had said about his legal status. But if you think that judges making catastrophically bad decisions represents the pinnacle of institutional failure, our modern era has provided us with examples that make 19th century legal disasters look quaint by comparison. Sometimes the most destructive mistakes in history are made not by people operating with limited information in difficult circumstances, but by leaders with access to all available intelligence who choose to ignore it in favour of what they want to believe. Our next story takes us to 2003, when the most powerful military in human history was unleashed based on evidence that didn't exist to solve problems that weren't real. 8. The weapons that weren't there. When the world's greatest military fights imaginary enemies, just as the Supreme Court in 1857 managed to make the Civil War inevitable through spectacular legal reasoning, in 2003, the administration of George W. Bush demonstrated that modern governments can still make decisions so fundamentally flawed that they reshape entire regions for decades. Sometimes the most catastrophic mistakes aren't made by people lacking information. The stage was set by September 11th, 2001, when 19 hijackers managed to turn commercial aircraft into weapons and kill nearly 3,000 Americans in a single morning. The attacks created a political atmosphere where doing anything seemed more important than doing the right thing, and where questioning official intelligence was treated as practically treasonous. President Bush and his advisors looked at the smoking ruins of the World Trade Center and decided that the lesson to be learned was that America couldn't wait for threats to fully materialize before taking action. This sounds reasonable, until you realize that it created a policy framework where the absence of evidence could be treated as evidence of absence, and where speculation could be transformed into certainty through repetition and conviction. Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, became the target of this new doctrine. The Bush administration claimed that Saddam possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and potentially nuclear weapons that posed an imminent threat to American security and regional stability. They also claimed that Saddam had operational ties to Al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization responsible for 9/11s. These weren't casual accusations thrown around during political debates. These were formal intelligence assessments presented to Congress, the United Nations, and the American people as established facts that justified the most serious action a nation can take, launching a war against another sovereign country. Secretary of State Colin Powell, a respected military leader with decades of experience, went before the United Nations Security Council with satellite photos, audio recordings, and detailed presentations that purported to show Iraqi weapons programs in action. Powell later described this presentation as a blot on his record, but at the time it was treated as definitive proof of Iraqi guilt. The problem was that United Nations weapons inspectors, who were actually in Iraq examining these alleged weapons sites, couldn't find any evidence of active weapons programs. Hans Blix and Mohammed El Baradei, leading the UN inspection teams, repeatedly reported that they needed more time to complete their work, but that their preliminary findings didn't support the American claims. This created an awkward situation for the Bush administration. The people who were actually looking for weapons couldn't find them, while the people who weren't in Iraq were certain they existed. Rather than treating this discrepancy as a reason for caution, the administration treated UN inspections as an obstacle to necessary action. Key American allies, including France and Germany, publicly opposed the invasion. These weren't anti-American countries looking to undermine US interests. These were NATO partners with their own intelligence services, who had examined the same evidence and reached different conclusions. Their opposition should have been a red flag that maybe the evidence wasn't as solid as claimed. Secretary General Kofi Annan later stated that the invasion was illegal under international law, a remarkable declaration from the head of an organization that generally tries to avoid taking definitive positions on controversial actions by major powers. This wasn't partisan politics. This was the international community's assessment that the United States had acted outside established legal frameworks. The invasion began on March 20th, 2003, with the kind of military efficiency that had made the American armed forces the envy of the world. Operation Iraqi Freedom utilized shock and awe tactics designed to overwhelm Iraqi resistance through the rapid application of overwhelming force. From a purely military standpoint, the initial invasion was a masterpiece of planning and execution. Coalition forces, led by about 160,000 American troops, swept across Iraq from Kuwait with the kind of speed and precision that military historians would study for decades. Baghdad fell on April 9th, 2003, less than 3 weeks after the invasion began. Saddam Hussein's government collapsed, his military dissolved, and his regime disappeared with remarkable speed. On May 1st, 2003, President Bush landed on the USS Abraham Lincoln and delivered a speech beneath a banner reading "Mission Accomplished." It was one of those moments that looks triumphant in real time, but becomes deeply ironic in hindsight, like declaring victory at halftime of a game that goes into multiple overtimes. Because the easy part was over, and the impossible part was just beginning. No weapons of mass destruction were found, not some weapons that were less dangerous than claimed, not old weapons left over from previous conflicts, not weapons programs that were in earlier stages of development than suggested. Nothing. The primary justification for the war simply didn't exist. The claimed operational ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda also proved to be non-existent. Intelligence agencies later concluded that these connections had been based on unreliable sources, wishful thinking, and a fundamental misunderstanding of how Middle Eastern political relationships actually worked. The reasons given for the war were later shown to be based on what investigators charitably called faulty intelligence, though critics used less diplomatic terms. The intelligence wasn't just slightly wrong or partially incorrect. It was so completely divorced from reality that it raises serious questions about how modern intelligence analysis can go so catastrophically wrong. But the absence of weapons of mass destruction was just the beginning of Iraq's problems. The rapid military victory had destroyed Iraq's government, army, and police force without creating any mechanism for replacing these institutions. It was like demolishing a building without having blueprints for what would be constructed in its place. The result was not liberation but chaos. Iraqi society, held together for decades by authoritarian control, suddenly had no control at all. Widespread looting began immediately after the fall of Baghdad. Government buildings, museums, hospitals, and infrastructure were stripped bare by crowds who understood that there was no longer any authority capable of stopping them. The power vacuum created by Saddam's removal was filled not by democratic institutions, but by sectarian violence, criminal organizations, and insurgent groups. Sunni and Shia communities that had been forced to coexist under Saddam's secular dictatorship began settling old scores with the kind of enthusiasm that made the original invasion look peaceful by comparison. An insurgency developed that would make the initial military victory seem like a minor skirmish. American forces found themselves fighting not a conventional enemy that could be defeated through superior firepower, but a dispersed network of groups using guerrilla tactics, improvised explosive devices, and suicide attacks. The human cost was staggering. Estimates of Iraqi civilian deaths range from hundreds of thousands to over 1 million, depending on methodology and time frame. Thousands of American and coalition soldiers were killed, with many more wounded. The psychological trauma affected not just combatants but entire communities across both Iraq and the United States. The financial cost was equally astronomical. The The invasion and subsequent occupation cost the United States over $2 trillion according to some estimates. This wasn't just the cost of military operations, but the long-term expenses of caring for wounded veterans, replacing destroyed equipment, and trying to rebuild a country that had been systematically destroyed. The broader regional consequences were even more far-reaching. The removal of Saddam Hussein, whatever his flaws as a leader, eliminated a major counterbalance to Iranian influence in the region. Iran, which had been contained by Iraqi power for decades, suddenly found itself the dominant regional force, with Iraqi Shia communities looking to Tehran for support and guidance. The chaos in Iraq also created opportunities for terrorist organizations that hadn't existed before the invasion. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which later evolved into ISIS, was able to establish territorial control in ways that would have been impossible under Saddam's authoritarian government. The invasion, designed to eliminate weapons of mass destruction, ended up creating conditions for even worse security threats. Perhaps most significantly, the Iraq War damaged American credibility in ways that extended far beyond the Middle East. The disconnect between official claims and observable reality convinced many people, both domestically and internationally, that American intelligence assessments couldn't be trusted, and that American military interventions were based more on political convenience than legitimate security concerns. This erosion of institutional trust had consequences that extended far beyond foreign policy. The gap between what officials claimed and what turned out to be true contributed to a broader skepticism about government statements, expert analysis, and media reporting that continues to shape American politics today. The Iraq War represents a perfect case study in how rational people can make completely irrational decisions when they start with false premises and refuse to question their assumptions. Every step in the process, from intelligence analysis to military planning to post-invasion administration, was executed with professional competence, but the entire enterprise was based on fundamental misunderstandings of the situation. But if you think that launching unnecessary wars based on non-existent evidence represents the pinnacle of governmental catastrophe, history offers us examples of mistakes so fundamental that they reshape entire civilizations for centuries. Sometimes the most devastating errors aren't made by modern politicians with access to global intelligence networks, but by ancient leaders trying to solve practical problems with reasonable-sounding solutions. Our next tale takes us back to the 3rd century, when the Roman Empire faced a crisis that threatened its very existence. The solution seemed obvious: divide the empire to make it easier to govern. What could possibly go wrong with splitting the most successful political system in human history? As it turned out, almost everything. 9. When practical solutions create permanent problems. While George W. Bush was discovering that modern military technology can't solve problems that don't actually exist, we travel back through time to witness how even the most successful empires can destroy themselves through perfectly reasonable reforms. Sometimes the most catastrophic mistakes in history are made not by incompetent leaders facing impossible situations, but by competent administrators applying logical solutions to complex problems. The year was 284 CE, and the Roman Empire was experiencing what historians diplomatically call the crisis of the 3rd century, which sounds much more academic than the reality of what was essentially 50 years of everything going wrong simultaneously. The empire was too large, too unstable, and under constant attack from Germanic tribes, Persian armies, and internal rebellions that popped up with the regularity of a broken-down bus. In 50 years, Rome had seen over 20 emperors, most of whom died violent deaths after brief reigns spent trying to hold together a political system that was clearly falling apart. It was like watching a civilization-sized version of musical chairs, except when the music stopped, someone usually got stabbed. Into this chaos stepped Diocletian, a career military officer who had worked his way up through the ranks and understood both the empire's problems and its potential solutions. He was exactly the kind of practical, experienced administrator that Rome needed, someone who could assess the situation objectively and implement reforms based on evidence rather than ideology. Diocletian's analysis of the empire's problems was essentially correct. Rome had grown too large for any single person to govern effectively. Communication across the empire took weeks or months, making centralized decision-making impossible during crises. When rebellions broke out in Britain, the emperor might not hear about them until they'd already succeeded or been crushed by local commanders acting independently. The military situation was even more challenging. The empire's borders stretched from Scotland to the Sahara Desert, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Euphrates River. Defending this enormous perimeter required constant troop movements, rapid response to multiple simultaneous threats, and coordination between military commanders who might be thousands of miles apart. Diocletian's solution was elegantly logical. If one emperor couldn't effectively govern the entire empire, then create more emperors. In 286 EE, he appointed Maximian as his co-emperor, dividing the empire between them. Diocletian would rule the eastern half from Nicomedia, while Maximian governed the west from Milan. This reform worked so well that Diocletian expanded it in 293 CE into what became known as the Tetrarchy, ruled by 4 emperors. Each of the senior emperors, called Augusti, chose a junior emperor called Caesar to help govern their territories. Diocletian selected Galerius for the eastern Caesar, while Maximian chose Constantius for the western Caesar. Each ruler had his own court, his own army, and his own administrative apparatus. They could respond quickly to local problems without waiting for approval from distant colleagues. The system brought immediate improvements in border defense, internal stability, and administrative efficiency. For the first time in decades, the Roman Empire looked like it might actually survive. The Tetrarchy represented everything that modern management consultants love: clear division of responsibility, decentralized decision-making, rapid response capabilities, and measurable improvements in organizational performance. The crisis of the 3rd century ended, borders were secured, and the empire enjoyed a period of stability that seemed to vindicate Diocletian's reforms completely. But there was one small problem with this brilliant administrative solution. It worked too well. The system was designed around the assumption that the 4 rulers would cooperate harmoniously for the good of the empire, subordinating personal ambition to collective benefit. This assumption turned out to be roughly as realistic as expecting 4 people to share a lottery ticket without anyone secretly hoping the others would disappear. Each of the 4 emperors developed his own power base, his own military forces, and his own administrative apparatus. They began to see themselves not as parts of a unified system, but as independent rulers whose interests might sometimes conflict with their colleagues. It was like creating 4 separate companies and expecting them to cooperate perfectly without any mechanism for resolving disputes. The fatal flaw in Diocletian's system became apparent in 305 CE, when he did something no Roman emperor had ever done before. He voluntarily retired. This wasn't abdication due to military defeat or political pressure. This was a planned transition based on the belief that the Tetrarchy could function without its founder. Diocletian's retirement plan called for the 2 Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, to become the new Augusti, while they would select new Caesars to complete the 4-person system. It was a logical succession plan that should have maintained stability while allowing for orderly leadership transitions. Instead, it immediately collapsed into civil war. The problem was that the previous emperors had sons who believed they had hereditary claims to power. Constantine, son of Constantius, and Maxentius, son of Maximian, weren't particularly interested in Diocletian's merit-based succession plan. They had armies, they had political supporters, and they had no intention of accepting subordinate positions in a system their fathers had helped create. What followed was a series of civil wars that lasted over 2 decades and involved multiple claimants to imperial power fighting each other across the empire. The very military forces that Diocletian had organized to defend against external enemies were now turned against each other in conflicts that devastated the territories they were supposed to protect. Constantine eventually emerged victorious, but his triumph came at enormous cost. The empire had been ravaged by decades of internal warfare, its administrative systems disrupted, and its military resources depleted. More importantly, the precedent of dividing imperial authority had been established. and future emperors would repeatedly attempt to recreate Diocletian's system with similarly chaotic results. The most significant long-term consequence of Diocletian's reforms was that they institutionalized the division between eastern and western portions of the empire. Even after Constantine reunified imperial authority, the administrative and military structures created by the Tetrarchy remained largely intact. The East and West continued to develop separately, with different priorities, different challenges, and increasingly different cultures. This growing divergence became permanent in 395 CE, when Emperor Theodosius died and the empire was divided between his two sons. Unlike Diocletian's temporary administrative arrangement, this division was intended to be permanent, creating separate Eastern and Western Roman empires that would never be reunified. The Western Roman Empire, deprived of the wealth and stability that had traditionally come from controlling the entire Mediterranean, proved unable to defend itself against Germanic invasions, internal rebellions, and economic collapse. It officially ended in 476 CE, when the last Western emperor was deposed by a Germanic chieftain. The Eastern Roman Empire, which became known as the Byzantine Empire, survived for another 1,000 years, but it was essentially a different civilization from the original Roman Empire. It spoke Greek rather than Latin, followed Eastern Orthodox Christianity rather than traditional Roman religion, and governed territories that were primarily in Asia and the Balkans rather than around the Mediterranean. Diocletian's administrative reforms, designed to save the Roman Empire, had instead fundamentally transformed it into something completely different. The unified Mediterranean civilization that had existed for centuries was replaced by separate Eastern and Western political systems that would often be enemies rather than allies. The irony is that Diocletian's analysis was entirely correct, and his reforms did exactly what they were supposed to do. The empire was too large for centralized governance, and dividing administrative responsibility did improve efficiency and responsiveness. The problem was that political systems, unlike corporate organizations, can't simply be restructured without considering the human dynamics of power, ambition, and loyalty. Diocletian had solved the immediate crisis facing the Roman Empire, but he had created the conditions for different, longer-term problems that would prove even more destructive. His reforms demonstrate how rational solutions to real problems can have unintended consequences that are worse than the original difficulties they were meant to address. The story of the Tetrarchy illustrates a fundamental challenge in governing large, complex organizations. Reforms that improve short-term performance can create structural weaknesses that manifest over longer time periods. What looks like brilliant management in year 1 can turn into catastrophic failure in year 20. But if you think that accidentally destroying the Roman Empire through its administrative efficiency represents the ultimate example of reform gone wrong, our next story will introduce you to a mistake so colossal that it managed to destroy the Soviet Union while simultaneously creating the conditions for decades of international terrorism. Sometimes the most catastrophic decisions in history are made by leaders who understand their immediate problems perfectly, but completely fail to anticipate the long-term consequences of their solutions. Our next tale takes us to 1979, when the Soviet Union decided to help a friendly government in Afghanistan deal with some local troublemakers. What could possibly go wrong with a quick military intervention to support an ally? As it turned out, absolutely everything. 10. The graveyard of empires claims another victim. The year was 1978, and Afghanistan had just experienced what Soviet planners probably thought was good news. A communist party called the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan had seized power in a coup. Finally, the USSR had a friendly, ideologically compatible government on its southern border. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. The new Afghan communist government, led by people who apparently understood Marx better than they understood Afghanistan, immediately began implementing sweeping social reforms that would have been progressive in Moscow, but were revolutionary in a traditional, tribal, deeply religious society that had been changing very slowly for centuries. They announced land redistribution, women's education programs, and secular legal systems, All perfectly reasonable policies if you're governing a society that wants to be modernized. Unfortunately, they were governing a society where many people considered these changes to be attacks on their fundamental way of life, their religious beliefs, and their traditional authority structures. The Afghan government's approach to social reform resembled a bull charging through a china shop, except the china shop was an ancient culture, and the bull was armed with Soviet military equipment. They weren't just changing policies, they were attempting to transform an entire civilization in a few years, whether that civilization wanted to be transformed or not. Afghan resistance formed quickly around groups called the Mujahedin, Islamic fighters who saw the communist government as an existential threat to their religion, their traditions and their independence. This wasn't just political opposition, this was a religious war against what many Afghans viewed as foreign-imposed atheism. The official Afghan army, trained and equipped by the Soviets, proved remarkably ineffective at dealing with this insurgency. This probably shouldn't have surprised anyone familiar with military history. Armies that represent unpopular governments tend to have morale problems, desertion issues, and an unfortunate tendency to lose battles against highly motivated opponents fighting on their home territory. By 1979, the Afghan communist government was losing control of the countryside. Major cities were under siege, and it was becoming clear that the grand experiment in rapid Afghan modernization was failing spectacularly. The government in Kabul sent increasingly desperate requests for help to their Soviet patrons. Soviet leaders, including Leonid Brezhnev, initially resisted these requests because they understood something important about Afghan history. It was littered with the remains of foreign armies that had arrived with confident plans and left as broken remnants. The British had learned this lesson multiple times during the 19th century, and Soviet military planners were well aware of Afghanistan's reputation as the graveyard of empires. But by December 1979, several factors combined to overcome Soviet caution. The Iranian Revolution had just created an Islamic republic on the USSR's southwestern border, and Soviet leaders were terrified that religious fundamentalism might spread to their own Muslim populations. They were also convinced that Afghan Prime Minister Hafizullah Amin might be secretly negotiating with the Americans, potentially giving the United States a strategic foothold in Central Asia. The Soviet plan seemed straightforward and limited. Send special forces to Kabul, remove the unreliable Amin, install the more moderate Babrak Karmal as leader, and restore stability to the Afghan government. It was supposed to be a quick operation, a surgical intervention that would solve the immediate problem without requiring a long-term military commitment. On December 24, 1979, Soviet airborne troops began landing at Kabul airport. 3 days later, Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace, killed Amin, and installed Karmal as the new Afghan leader. From a purely tactical standpoint, the operation was executed flawlessly, quick, efficient, and completely successful in achieving its immediate objectives. The problem was that achieving immediate objectives and solving long-term problems turned out to be completely different things. Instead of stabilizing Afghanistan, the Soviet intervention had exactly the opposite effect. Afghan resistance to the communist government had been significant but localized. Resistance to Soviet occupation became national and religious. The presence of foreign troops transformed a civil conflict into a jihad and gave the Mujahideen something that insurgencies always need, a clear foreign enemy that could unite diverse opposition groups. The war that Soviet leaders had tried to prevent became inevitable, and it became the kind of war that conventional armies are least equipped to fight. The Soviets could control major cities and key transportation routes, but the Mujahideen controlled most of the mountainous countryside and could strike at Soviet forces almost anywhere using guerrilla tactics perfected over centuries of resisting foreign invaders. Soviet forces responded with a kind of firepower that had worked against conventional armies in World War II, but which proved counterproductive against guerrilla insurgencies. Heavy bombing of rural areas created more refugees and more grievances against the government. The widespread use of landmines made vast areas of Afghanistan uninhabitable but didn't significantly reduce Mujahideen mobility. Meanwhile, the United States saw the Soviet intervention as an opportunity to give the USSR its own Vietnam-style quagmire. The CIA launched Operation Cyclone, a massive covert program that eventually provided billions of dollars in weapons, training and financial support to the Mujahideen. Pakistani intelligence services served as intermediaries, ensuring that the most effective weapons reached Afghan fighters while maintaining American deniability. The irony was spectacular. The two superpowers of the Cold War were fighting a proxy war in one of the world's poorest countries, using Afghan lives as the currency of their global competition. The Soviets were trying to prevent American influence in Central Asia, while the Americans were trying to bleed Soviet resources and credibility. Afghanistan became the battlefield where both sides pursued strategies that had nothing to do with Afghan interests. The war dragged on for nearly a decade, costing the Soviet Union enormous amounts of money, equipment and prestige. Unlike previous Soviet military interventions in Hungary or Czechoslovakia, which had been completed quickly with minimal casualties, Afghanistan became a grinding attrition that consumed resources without producing victories. Soviet casualties mounted steadily. Approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed and many more wounded during the 9-year conflict. For a society that had been told the intervention would be brief and limited, these losses created growing domestic opposition to the war. The economic cost was equally devastating. The Soviet Union was already struggling with economic stagnation, and the Afghan war drained resources that could have been used for domestic development or other military priorities. The war became a significant factor in the economic problems that would eventually contribute to the Soviet Union's collapse. By the mid-1980s, new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev recognized that the Afghan intervention had become a strategic disaster that was weakening the Soviet Union without achieving any meaningful objectives. The war was unwinnable using conventional military methods, but escalation would have risked even greater costs and potentially direct confrontation with the United States. Gorbachev began planning Soviet withdrawal, but extricating 100,000 troops from an active war zone while maintaining some semblance of dignity proved almost as difficult as the original intervention. The withdrawal process took several years and was completed in February 1989, leaving behind an Afghan government that survived for exactly 3 more years before collapsing completely. The human cost of the Soviet-Afghan war was staggering. Between 1 and 3 million Afghan civilians died during the conflict. Depending on which estimates you accept, millions more became refugees, fleeing to Pakistan and Iran to escape the fighting. Large areas of Afghanistan were depopulated, and much of the country's infrastructure was destroyed. The war also had profound long-term consequences that extended far beyond Afghanistan's borders. The Mujahideen fighters who had been trained and equipped to fight the Soviets didn't simply disappear when the war ended. Many of them formed the core of various terrorist organizations, including Al-Qaeda, that would later target Western interests worldwide. The collapse of the Afghan government in 1992 led to a civil war among various Mujahideen factions, which eventually resulted in the rise of the Taliban, the same forces that had been supported by the United States and Pakistan to fight the Soviets became the foundation for a fundamentalist regime that would later harbour the terrorists responsible for September 11th. The Soviet-Afghan War represents one of history's clearest examples of how limited military interventions can spiral into unlimited disasters. Every decision made sense in its immediate context. The Soviets wanted to help an ally, prevent American influence, and maintain stability on their border. But the cumulative effect of these reasonable decisions was to create a conflict that hastened the Soviet Union's collapse, while establishing Afghanistan as a training ground for international terrorism. The war demonstrated that even superpowers have limits, and that military force cannot solve political problems that require social and cultural solutions. It also showed how proxy conflicts between major powers can devastate the countries where they're fought, creating long-term instability that affects global security for decades. But if you think that accidentally destroying your own empire while trying to help an ally represents the ultimate example of strategic miscalculation, our next story will demonstrate how even the most successful empires can be brought down by their own generosity. Sometimes the most catastrophic mistakes in history are made not by enemies or incompetent leaders, but by well-meaning allies who create problems they never intended to solve. Our penultimate tale takes us to 18th century France, where King Louis XVI's decision to support American independence would ultimately cost him his head and transform European civilization forever. Part 11. The King Who Funded His Own Execution. When supporting democracy becomes suicide. King Louis XVI ascended to the French throne in 1774, inheriting a kingdom that was facing the kind of problems that would challenge any ruler: massive debt from previous wars, growing social tensions, and a government system that hadn't been updated since the Middle Ages. But Louis had something that many of his predecessors lacked: good intentions and a genuine desire to help people who were fighting for freedom. Unfortunately, good intentions combined with poor judgment can be more dangerous than malicious competence. The American colonists' rebellion against British rule presented Louis with what seemed like a perfect opportunity to strike back against France's traditional enemy while supporting a just cause. The British had humiliated France during the 7 Years' War, stripping away much of France's colonial empire and establishing Britain as the dominant global power. Supporting the American rebels offered a chance for revenge that was both strategically sound and morally satisfying. French military advisors argued that British involvement in a costly colonial war would weaken Britain's position in Europe while potentially restoring France's status as a major power. French intellectuals, influenced by Enlightenment ideas about liberty and self-governance, saw the American cause as a noble struggle against tyranny. French merchants anticipated profitable trade opportunities with an independent America. Everyone agreed that supporting the Americans was a brilliant idea. The only problem was that nobody had done the math. France began by secretly providing weapons and financial support to the American rebels through dummy corporations and covert channels. This seemed like a cost-effective way to damage British interests without risking direct confrontation. But secret support proved insufficient when it became clear that the Americans needed more substantial help to avoid defeat. In 1778, France formally entered the war as an American ally, committing the French navy and army to what became a global conflict against Britain. French forces fought in the Caribbean, supported American operations along the Atlantic coast, and played a crucial role in the siege of Yorktown that ultimately forced British surrender. The strategy worked perfectly from a military standpoint. British forces were defeated, American independence was secured, and France had successfully humbled its greatest rival. The Treaty of Paris in 1783 confirmed American independence and restored some French territorial losses from previous conflicts. But victory came at a price that would prove catastrophic for the French monarchy. The war had cost France approximately 1.3 billion livres, a sum so enormous that it's difficult to comprehend in modern terms. To put this in perspective, France's annual revenue was only about 500 million livres, meaning the American war cost more than 2.5 years of the entire kingdom's income. This wasn't money that France had sitting around in treasury accounts. The kingdom had financed the war through borrowing, creating a debt crisis that would dominate French politics for the next decade. Interest payments on the national debt consumed about half of the government's annual revenue, leaving insufficient funds for basic governmental functions. But the financial crisis was only part of the problem. French soldiers and officers who had served in America returned home with dangerous ideas about liberty, equality, and representative government. They had seen a society where merit mattered more than birth, where citizens could participate in government, and where written constitutions limited governmental power. The Marquis de Lafayette, who had served as a volunteer in the American army, became one of the most prominent advocates for applying American principles to French society. Other French veterans brought back similar convictions that the political system they had fought to establish in America could work just as well in France. French intellectuals, already influenced by Enlightenment philosophy, found their theoretical support for democratic ideals reinforced by the practical example of American success. If Americans could govern themselves effectively, why couldn't the French? If colonists could overthrow an established government and create a better system, what did that say about the legitimacy of absolute monarchy? These ideas might have remained confined to intellectual circles if France hadn't also been facing a severe financial crisis that made governmental reform urgent. The debt from the American War forced Louis to call the Estates General in 1789, the first meeting of this representative body since 1614, to approve new taxes. The Estates General was supposed to rubber stamp royal tax proposals and then disband. Instead, it transformed itself into the National Assembly and began demanding the kind of constitutional reforms that French veterans had seen working in America. The financial crisis created by supporting American independence had created the political conditions for French Revolution. What followed was the complete destruction of the old regime that Louis had been trying to preserve. The National Assembly abolished feudalism, seized church property, and created a constitutional monarchy that reduced the king to a figurehead. These weren't gradual reforms. They were revolutionary changes that transformed France from an absolute monarchy into a republic within 4 years. Louis initially tried to work within the new system, accepting constitutional limitations on royal power and attempting to govern as a constitutional monarch. But he also secretly negotiated with foreign powers and royalist exiles, seeking support for a counter-revolution that would restore absolute monarchy. In 1791, Louis and his family attempted to flee France and join émigré nobles who were organizing resistance to the revolution. They were captured at Varennes and brought back to Paris, where the failed escape attempt convinced many French people that their king could not be trusted to respect the constitutional system. The discovery of Louis's secret correspondence with foreign enemies of the revolution provided evidence that he had been working against the government he had sworn to support. By 1792, radical revolutionaries argued that the monarchy itself was incompatible with liberty and that Louis represented a permanent threat to the Republic. European monarchs, terrified that revolutionary ideas might spread to their own kingdoms, began preparing military intervention to restore Louis to absolute power. The Brunswick Manifesto threatened terrible consequences for the French people if any harm came to the royal family, which had exactly the opposite effect from what was intended. Instead of protecting Louis, foreign threats convinced French revolutionaries that the monarchy was a tool of foreign enemies and that the king's continued existence endangered the revolution. On August 10, 1792, Parisian crowds stormed the Tuileries Palace, ending the constitutional monarchy and beginning the Republic. Louis was imprisoned, tried for treason, and found guilty of conspiring against the liberty of the nation. On January 21, 1793, he was executed by guillotine in what is now the Place de la Concorde, where thousands of Parisians cheered as the king, who had helped create American democracy, lost his head to French democracy. The irony is almost too perfect. Louis XVI had financed American independence, which established the democratic principles that French revolutionaries used to justify overthrowing the French monarchy. He had created the intellectual framework and practical example that his own enemies would use against him. But the execution of Louis was only the beginning of the revolution's radicalization. The elimination of the monarchy removed the last symbol of traditional authority, opening the way for the Reign of Terror, the rise of Napoleon, and decades of European warfare that would reshape the continent. The wars that followed the French Revolution killed millions of people and destroyed the old European political system. The revolutionary ideas that Louis had helped nurture in America spread throughout Europe, inspiring democratic movements that would challenge traditional monarchies for the next century. Louis XVI's support for American independence represents one of history's most spectacular examples of unintended consequences. His decision was strategically sound, morally justifiable, and initially successful, but it created the financial crisis and intellectual framework that would ultimately destroy the monarchy he was trying to strengthen. The story demonstrates how supporting admirable causes can have unexpected results when those causes succeed beyond your ability to control their consequences. Louis wanted to help Americans achieve independence from Britain. He ended up helping them create a model of government that would inspire his own subjects to demand independence from him. Part 12. The Emperor Who Forgot About Winter. When military genius meets geographic reality, just as Louis XVI discovered that supporting democratic revolutions could be hazardous to monarchical health, his successor, the man who rose from the chaos of the French Revolution, was about to demonstrate that even military genius has its limits when confronted with basic facts about weather, distance, and the Russian approach to hospitality. Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered most of Europe through a combination of tactical brilliance, strategic innovation, and an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at the right time, with exactly the right number of cannons. By 1812, he controlled territory from Spain to Poland, had defeated every major European power except Britain, and was widely considered the greatest military mind since Alexander the Great. He was also about to make the kind of mistake that would make all our previous disasters look like minor administrative errors. The problem was Russia, which had been part of Napoleon's continental system, a trade embargo designed to strangle British commerce by preventing European countries from trading with Britain. Tsar Alexander I had initially cooperated with this policy, but by 1812, Russian merchants and nobles were growing tired of watching their economy suffer for the sake of Napoleon's anti-British strategy. When Russia began allowing neutral ships to trade with Britain, Napoleon faced a choice: accept that his continental system was failing, or enforce it through military action. Being Napoleon, he chose the option that involved enormous armies and dramatic gestures. He assembled the Grande Armée, nearly 500,000 soldiers drawn from across the French Empire and its allied states. This wasn't just a French army. It was a multinational force that included Germans, Italians, Poles, Dutch, and soldiers from a dozen other nationalities. It was the largest army Europe had ever seen, a force so massive that it took 3 days just to cross a single river. Napoleon's plan was characteristically ambitious and seemingly logical. March this enormous army into Russia, defeat the Russian army in a decisive battle, capture Moscow, and force Alexander to rejoin the continental system. He expected the campaign to last about 6 months, ending with Russian capitulation and European trade policy firmly under French control. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, as the Grande Armée crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon had planned meticulously, organizing supply trains, establishing communication lines, and preparing for the kind of rapid, decisive campaign that had made him master of Europe. What he hadn't planned for was that the Russians might have their own ideas about how this war should be fought. Instead of offering the decisive battle that Napoleon wanted, the Russian army began a strategic withdrawal deeper into their own territory. This wasn't cowardice or poor planning. This was a deliberate strategy designed to stretch Napoleon's supply lines, exhaust his troops, and draw the French army farther from its bases. As the Russians retreated, they implemented a scorched earth policy, destroying crops, burning villages, and removing anything that the French army might use to sustain itself. Napoleon had expected to feed his army off the Russian countryside, but the Russians were ensuring that the countryside had nothing to offer. The Grande Armée found itself marching through a landscape that had been systematically stripped of everything useful. Villages were empty, fields were burned, and wells were poisoned. Instead of the abundant supplies that Napoleon had anticipated, his soldiers found only destruction and emptiness. Even before any major battles occurred, the army was already suffering significant casualties from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. Marching 500,000 men across hundreds of miles of hostile territory proved to be a logistical nightmare that Napoleon's planning had underestimated. When the first major battle finally occurred at Borodino on September 7th, it was a Pyrrhic victory for the French. Napoleon's forces drove the Russians from the field, but both armies suffered enormous casualties, approximately 70,000 total killed and wounded in a single day of fighting. The Russians withdrew in good order, their army still intact and capable of continued resistance. Napoleon entered Moscow on September 14th, expecting to find the Russian government ready to negotiate surrender. Instead, he found a city that had been largely evacuated and was beginning to burn. The fires that consumed much of Moscow weren't accidental. They were set by the Russians to deny Napoleon the supplies and shelter he needed for his army. Napoleon waited in the burning city for 5 weeks, expecting Alexander to send envoys seeking peace terms. The envoys never came. The Tsar was apparently willing to let his ancient capital burn rather than submit to French demands. As October turned to November, Napoleon realized that his position was becoming untenable. He couldn't feed 100,000 soldiers through a Russian winter in a burned-out city, and staying in Moscow would mean certain disaster when winter weather made movement impossible. The retreat from Moscow began on October 19th, and immediately became one of the greatest military disasters in history. Napoleon had planned to withdraw along a different route through territory that hadn't been devastated during the advance, but Russian forces blocked the alternate routes, forcing the French to retreat along the same path they had used for the invasion. This meant marching through territory that had already been stripped bare in increasingly cold weather, while under constant harassment from Russian forces, who had the advantage of local knowledge and winter clothing. The Russian winter of 1812 was particularly harsh, with temperatures dropping well below zero and heavy snowfall that made movement extremely difficult. Napoleon's soldiers were still wearing summer uniforms because the winter supplies had never caught up with the rapidly moving army. Frostbite, hypothermia, and starvation began claiming thousands of lives daily. Discipline collapsed as soldiers abandoned their weapons and equipment to focus on basic survival. The Grande Armée transformed from a disciplined military force into a desperate mob of freezing, starving men struggling through the snow. Russian peasants and Cossack cavalry attacks added to the misery, picking off stragglers and attacking supply convoys. The famous crossing of the Berezina River became a nightmare of desperation, as thousands of soldiers drowned or froze to death while trying to escape pursuing Russian forces. On December 5th, Napoleon abandoned his army and raced back to Paris, leaving his commanders to manage the remainder of the retreat. This wasn't just a military decision. It was an acknowledgement that the campaign had failed so completely that his personal presence could no longer affect the outcome. Of the nearly 500,000 soldiers who had entered Russia, fewer than 120,000 crossed back into Poland, and many of those were wounded, sick, or disabled. The Grande Armée had been virtually destroyed, not primarily by Russian military action, but by the combination of distance, weather, and logistical failure. The disaster in Russia destroyed Napoleon's reputation for invincibility and encouraged his enemies throughout Europe to form a new coalition against him. Within 2 years he would be defeated at Leipzig, forced to abdicate, and exiled to Elba. Although he would return for the famous 100 Days ending at Waterloo, his power had been fundamentally broken by the Russian campaign. Napoleon's invasion of Russia represents the ultimate example of how strategic overreach can destroy even the most successful military careers. Every element of his plan made sense in isolation. He had numerical superiority, tactical expertise, and a clear political objective. What he lacked was adequate appreciation for the practical challenges of fighting a winter war in Russia against opponents who were willing to sacrifice everything to avoid defeat. 12. The eternal human capacity for spectacular failure. And there you have it, a guided tour through some of humanity's most spectacular mistakes. From Austrian soldiers shooting each other over alcohol to Napoleon freezing his army to death in pursuit of trade policy. What emerges from these stories isn't just a catalogue of historical disasters, but a pattern that reveals something fundamental about human nature and decision-making. Each of these catastrophes was caused by intelligent people making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. The Austrian commanders didn't intend to start a battle with themselves. The Wiener Joseph people weren't trying to commit cultural suicide. Sir Cyril Radcliffe wasn't attempting to create one of history's worst refugee crises. Trofim Lysenko genuinely believed his theories would feed the Soviet people. The thread connecting all these disasters is the gap between human intention and human outcome, our remarkable ability to create consequences we never intended through actions we thought were sensible. We are a species that can split atoms and explore space, but we still haven't figured out how to reliably predict what will happen when we try to change things. Perhaps the most sobering lesson from these stories is that catastrophic mistakes aren't made only by obviously incompetent people. They're made by experts, professionals, and leaders who understood their immediate situations but failed to anticipate how their solutions would interact with the broader world. The worst disasters often come from the most confident decision makers. These historical failures also demonstrate that the most dangerous moment for any society isn't when things are obviously going wrong, but when they appear to be going right. The Austrian army was winning when they destroyed themselves. The Mamluk system worked brilliantly until it worked too well. Diocletian's reforms solved the immediate crisis while creating conditions for long-term collapse. But perhaps the most important lesson is that understanding these patterns doesn't make us immune to repeating them. Every generation believes it's smarter than its predecessors, better informed, more rational. Every generation discovers new ways to demonstrate that intelligence and wisdom aren't the same thing, and that good intentions can lead to catastrophic outcomes. The capacity for spectacular failure isn't a bug in human civilization. It's a feature. It's the inevitable result of being a species smart enough to attempt complex solutions, but not quite smart enough to fully understand complex systems. We're forever doomed to be slightly less clever than we think we are, in a world that's slightly more complicated than we imagine. And somehow, despite creating disasters that destroy empires and kill millions, we keep trying, we keep making decisions, implementing reforms, and attempting to solve problems, because the alternative, doing nothing, guarantees failure, while action at least offers the possibility of success, even if it also creates the possibility of spectacular catastrophe. So the next time you're faced with a decision that seems obviously correct, remember the Austrian army and their defensive position around alcohol. Remember Nongko Wu's and her optimistic prophecy. Remember Napoleon and his perfectly logical invasion plan. Then make your decision anyway, because that's what humans do. We fail spectacularly, learn partially, and try again with slightly better information and exactly the same overconfidence that got us into trouble the last time. It's the most human thing we do, and we're extraordinarily good at it. If you enjoyed this journey through human incompetence, make sure you're subscribed for more tales of civilizations making decisions that seemed brilliant right up until they weren't. Hit that notification bell so you'll know when we upload our next deep dive into humanity's spectacular talent for turning victory into disaster. And remember, the next time someone confidently tells you their plan can't possibly fail, just smile and nod. History suggests they're probably right about everything, except the part where their plan can't possibly fail. Because if there's one thing humans are truly exceptional at, it's proving that there's always a new way to be spectacularly, historically, unforgettably wrong. Thanks for joining me on this tour of human catastrophe. Until next time, try not to accidentally destroy any civilizations.